Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser, and for today's episode, I have on with me a very special guest. I'm pleased to welcome in Jim Hayward. You may remember Jim because he was the man behind Slammie Productions, and he's done so much else in his life that we're going to get into. But Jim is here to tell a story. Hey, Jim, welcome into the podcast. Great to have you.
Hey, Jeff, it's great to be here. Actually, it's an honor to be here. I really admire what you're doing with this podcast and the video version. I've been watching and listening since the very beginning, and I think it's very important to document the history, the recent, and also the older history of the Florida music scene. It's very crucial, I think, and it helps a lot, especially nowadays when zines have gone away and a lot of the ways we used to document the scene have kind of gone away. So you're filling a very important role. I just love it.
Well, I appreciate that, Jim. It's an honor, and I'm so glad to have you on to tell your story because you definitely have a good one. I am confident of that because it spans quite a number of years. And I know that thinking about some of your earliest beginnings, you didn't necessarily grow up in South Florida. You were born in Jersey. So I'd like to talk about some of your earliest years, where you grew up, and then some of your earliest memories getting into music.
Okay, cool. Yes. But, off the top, everyone remembers Slammie Productions or Slammies or the Slammie Awards. I'm the guy that kind of started it all going. So just for frame of reference, I was not big on putting my name or my face or my image out there as a personality in the scene. I let Slammie speak for itself, and I've really not talked about my history that much. So I'm hoping maybe this will be illuminating. Maybe it'll be boring to people, but who knows? And anyway, back in the 70s, a lot of people were moving from Jersey to Florida. That was sort of the thing to do. My parents, grandparents, all that. My parents moved down here, and then I went to high school in Lake Worth. So I kind of came from the Northeast, and my father was in the concert business himself in the 70s. He was a major concert promoter in the Northeast, Al Hayward. He and his partner, John Scher, who went on to be a major promoter in the Northeast. They opened a venue called the Capitol Theater in Passaic, which for many, many years was a big venue in the Northeast. I was very young, obviously. I was not going to concerts at that age. I did go to a concert at age 11. I believe it was a folk festival. My parents and grandparents allowed me to go see Richie Havens. So I don't know when that was, around 1970, 71 or so. I saw a big Richie Havens concert, a folk festival. And, I kind of lived that in that era. You kind of just lived that life. I mean, my father was into custom car shows before he was into concerts. So I was just kind of exposed to that kind of whole arena of that era. It was sort of not a big deal to me. And then when I moved to Florida, we kind of settled down. My parents were divorced at that point, and I was living with my mother and stepfather, and kind of faded. All that old 60s and 70s stuff kind of faded away in my rearview mirror. So I went to high school like a normal kid, but
where did you land in Florida when your family moved?
That's when I landed in Lake Worthless, as opposed to Fort Lauderdale. We had a name for everything.
What was Lake Worth like at the time that you got there?
In the 70s, Lake Worth was, I don't know, it was kind of sleepy town. It wasn't a whole lot going on. Wasn't a whole lot going on anywhere, really, in that time frame, just looking back on it. But it was cool. I mean, I loved being in Florida and being around my family and just hanging out. It was a lot more laid back than growing up in the Northeast or Midwest. I spent some years in Ohio as well. But when I was a kid, so I didn't really do anything until I moved here and got my driver's license, and then got into high school and started messing around and met some guys and met some girls, and started going to a few concerts here and there. I wasn't really huge into music, but I had this background. I just kind of, it was just inside of me. I remember when I was young, my father had this huge record collection in his living room, and I would go through there and look through all the old albums, and there's Led Zeppelin 1 and Led Zeppelin 2. And, I picked out albums, Hendrix, and I would listen to them at a very young age. So I was exposed to a lot of rock and styles of music that, other kids probably weren't listening to. I'm guessing. I don't know. Maybe they were. But by the time the 70s and 80s rolled around, the late 70s, it was the disco era. It was kind of a crappy time for music, and in the national scheme of things. So, we were kind of just, goofing around. Punk rock came out. I was just exploring different kinds of music with my friends, and I was more into journalism. So I ended up going into writing and editing. I was the editor, sports editor of my high school paper, and went on to Palm Beach Community College, where I edited the paper there. And I lucked into a job at age 18 at the Palm Beach Post as they called it copy person. I guess it was called copy boy back in the day, and they, be politically correct, they started calling it copy person. Anyway, it was sort of like a gopher kind of job. I was just a freshman in college, but I used that opportunity to kind of learn the entire way the newspaper worked. So I kind of learned the newspaper from the ground up. And these were the days, 1979, 80, before computers. I was actually taking copy off the wire, stripping stories and giving them to editors and running around and actually going to get the editor's dinner and doing all kinds of things. I did a little bit of everything. I wrote the weather for the page. Wow. It was crazy just being in that environment. It really was a smoke-filled newsroom. Back in those days, you could smoke in offices, and it was like you see in the movies. So sure. I sort of fell in love with that lifestyle. And, just to fast forward, I ended up, staying in journalism for more than 40 years. So
wow, that's a long time.
I retired in 2022 after roughly 40 years with the Palm Beach Post. So from that start, I kind of got in the fast lane with journalism. And there was one night I remember, not vaguely, I remember it very clearly. December, I guess it was 1980. I was working late. The editors were mostly gone. There was one editor there. And just in case something happened, I was still looking at the wire machine. The editors needed me to bring them the stories. They weren't just popping up on computer screens. So the story came across the wire really late, and it said something like somebody had been shot in New York City, and it was a bulletin, and it ended up being John Lennon. So the bulletin when John Lennon was shot came across the wire service, and I brought it to the editor, and I said, I think this might be important. Maybe we should get this in the paper late. And it ended up developing as a story, and a tragic story. And, that was kind of exciting to me. It was sort of the excitement of being there. It was a tragic event. And the next day, there were, tributes, and people all over Palm Beach and the world were out, paying tribute to John. But just to be there at that particular moment, I might have been the first person in the county to see that news, unless somebody at the TV station was monitoring their wire too. But, that was sort of like, a moment that I remember in journalism. And then I went to UF. I went to University of Florida. So, to really get my feet in the door as an editor and as a writer, I had to get my degree. So Palm Beach Community was not enough, although it was fun being here in those years, hanging out with my friends and going to shows at the Sportatorium. And I probably went to Van Halen as my first show at the Sportatorium. I'm trying to think 1980-ish. Somewhere around there, but
what was your first impression of the Sportatorium when you started seeing shows there?
I really had no frame of reference. I mean, I hadn't been going to, I'd been to Madison Square Garden, but not for a concert. So I kind of knew there was a difference. This is Florida. It's not, a major city. It was kind of rough. It got rougher. It was. They just kind of let it go, but it was a fun place to see a show though. At that point, kind of low budget, low brow. I don't know. The tickets were cheap. You could get in for less than $10 to a lot of major concerts. So it was fun to have that. And West Palm Beach Auditorium, I remember going to a few shows when I was in my teens.
Who'd you see there?
I don't really remember it. In those days, there was a lot of like Molly Hatchet and Atlanta Rhythm Section and these bands. Boston Doobie Brothers. It was kind of boring, it was boring music. We were just there for the concert and had to have fun. But, Palm punk and underground music were bubbling up, and I wasn't really that aware of it at that point, but I knew it was there. I was aware of the Ramones, and they actually came to West Palm and played a club. And we would go to clubs too and see bands in clubs. But, in those days, the club scene, at least in Palm Beach, was not that spectacular. I was not going to date in Broward yet. I was only 18, 19.
When you were in Gainesville, did you experience any local music there at UF?
A little bit. I was only in Gainesville for 2 years. So I transferred, got my degree. But I was going out as much as I could. I wanted to graduate, but I still found myself I love going to rock clubs and just seeing any band. If it was Thursday night, oh, there's a band playing somewhere, I'll go see them. Nobody in particular. I remember going to Dubs quite a few times. I don't know if you know the story of Dubs. That was where Tom Petty and a lot of bands kind of broke in.
Little bit, yeah. What was that like?
And Dub was this old guy. He passed away a long time ago. It was his club, and he would sit at the very top in the very back of the bar, and then, oh, there's Dub. He's here. It's sort of like a Porky's, like that character in Porky's. It's kind of a unusual character. Anyway, the band Axe, who came out of Gainesville, I remember seeing them there. They were like a hard rock band. I was getting into metal and hard rock at the time. This was early 80s. New wave of British heavy metal kind of impressed me. So I started getting into Metallica and those kinds of bands. But I was also being exposed to punk and new wave bands too. New wave was kind of a big deal. So there was just a lot of stuff going on all of a sudden. Like the 70s were boring, and then all of a sudden stuff started happening in the 80s. And I just happened to be in Gainesville during those years, and then had to find a job. So I could have gone back to Palm Beach to the Post, which I ended up doing, but I had a little detour first. I went to work in Miami. I got a job right out of college in '83 at a place called Viewtron, which is actually owned by the Miami Herald. The Miami Herald and Knight Ridder, who owned the Herald, was doing this experimental thing that nobody could understand at that point in time. It was called online news. So we're actually putting news online in the early 80s. And this was before before laptops even existed. You had to buy a set-top box for your television. And AT&T, I think, was involved. And you could go to Sears and buy these things. They were expensive. So it was like a test market in Coral Gables. So I still meet people once in a while. Oh yeah, I lived in Coral Gables. I used to see Viewtron. It was way, way, way ahead of its time.
Did you move down there, or did you just commute?
No. I got an apartment in North Miami Beach. Very, very low salary. I mean, journalists still don't get me wrong, they're not being paid any better today. But I mean, in those days, my first salary, I don't remember, $13,000 a year or something ridiculous to live in Miami. So I had a crappy little apartment in North Miami Beach. And I would commute from North Miami Beach into downtown, or actually the Viewtron offices were on the beach, on South Beach, on Lincoln Road, before Lincoln Road it was just a crappy, this was like the crappy days of South Beach, but,
Were there different places where live music was happening that you were learning about?
Oh, yeah.
Having now moved down to Miami?
Yeah, this is the turning point. This is where the story gets interesting because like a mile from my apartment in North Miami Beach was this little record store called Open Books and Records. I knew nothing about it, but I wandered in there one day. And turns out it's a cool record store. And I met Leslie Wimmer over time, and Leslie and I became friends and ended up working together for many decades. But so that was one thing. And then Open Books and Records was a scene store. As you know, everything was revolved around, in those days, record stores, clubs, zines. So you go to the record store, you pick up the zines, you pick up the flyers, you find out where the shows are. And Leslie even had a concert line. You'd call in back in those days. Again, you didn't have internet, so you would get these recorded messages on her answering machine, telling you where all the cool concerts were. I used to love that. So I think that's probably how I found out about Flynn's. So Flynn's on South Beach. It was actually probably more toward North Beach, I think. It was just a crappy club and a hotel on the beach, but everybody in the punk scene played there. I mean, the stories are voluminous. You've probably heard about Flynn's, and it was only around for a couple of years. So I just happened to be there during those 2 years, and I was on my drive home from work. So unfortunately, I work nights a lot. So I would get out of work at midnight or so. I'd miss a lot of shows because of that. But sometimes I'd get there late, catch a late show or catch a show on my days off. So I remember seeing the Screaming Sneakers play there quite a few times. They were cool. A lot of local bands I was exposed to at Flynn's and some national acts. And I met DJ Rick Lennick, who's no longer with us. He was like a cool guy to meet, really friendly guy. I just started meeting people like that in the scene that I had no aspirations at this point. I'm working in, a low-paying journalism job. So I'm just kind of trying to get into the music scene, which was really cool at the time. I think that was like a really fun time to be in the music scene. And I was going to shows whenever I could. One memorable show I went to, and this kind of also opened my eyes to shows that were beyond the clubs. I always thought, oh yeah, this is a bar, people are drinking, it's a show. But Richard Shelter was putting on shows all over the place, and I happened to pick up one of his flyers, and I went to see Black Flag play at the Fireman's Hall in Fort Lauderdale. This was probably around '85, I'm guessing. I know you had Richard on. That was sort of like, looking back on it, that's sort of like a seminal moment for me, because I think what Richard was doing later influenced me, and also shows like that, seeing Black Flag play at a venue, a DIY kind of thing, that sort of also opened my eyes to what was happening, what could be done. And it was just a cool thing to do.
What was the vibe like of the crowd for, as far as what you can remember from that Black Flag show?
It was all ages too. That's the other thing. I had been used to going to, back in the 70s and 80s, it was like most nightclubs were 21 and up or 18 and older. Back then, it was a lower drinking age. But at any rate, there was no such thing as an all ages show unless you went to a concert venue like an arena. There was sort of no niche for that, but it was growing, and the Cameo Theater was kind of filling that niche a little bit. And, it was just kind of a growing thing, a growing underground. And I could, sense that the underground scene was kind of finally happening in Florida. Florida's a little bit behind some other parts of the country typically, but I think we were kind of little bit on the cutting edge in that time period. It was kind of cool to be around.
Sure.
Oh, there's one other I forgot to mention. If you're asking about concerts, another memorable one. When I was in Gainesville, I didn't go to many shows there because, again, it was sort of like not a great time for shows. But I think the year before I went to Gainesville, I was visiting and trying to figure out, where I was going to, where I was going to live. And my buddies were there, and we went to see the Plasmatics at the Halloween ball at the I can't remember what they called it, the bandstand, or it was outdoors on campus, 20,000 people, crazy.
Wow.
Probably one of the craziest concerts I ever remember. I wasn't that close to the stage. I just remember things blowing up on stage and Wendy taking off her top, and it was a Halloween ball. So everyone was in costume. It was just nuts. If you look it up online, there's unconfirmed reports of all kinds of debauchery happening that night. It was sort of like the peak of that time period of craziness. So that concert just stuck in my memory as sort of like, this was a crazy thing. So I moved on from that, but the craziness came back years later and in different formats. So it was sort of something I just thought of as, oh yeah, that happened. But
glad you shared that one, because that's a good story.
Yeah, I don't know how many. I'm sure there's a lot of people around who are at that show. It was just. I think you can find YouTube videos on it. It's just one of these crazy shows. So
you had mentioned about some of the places happening in Miami at this time, Flynn's, but also places that may not have been known for shows like Fireman's Hall and that type thing. But at the same time, there was some venues starting to pop up in Broward, right? So Hollywood, Hallandale, the Button South, the Treehouse, and that type thing. So did you start to experience shows there too?
Yes, for sure. Because I moved to Hollywood. I had enough of North Miami Beach. Nothing wrong with North Miami Beach, but I had the opportunity to move to Hollywood and share a house with a coworker. So that was a much better scenario. And Hollywood just happened to be close to this. I was close to the Sportatorium, so that's when I really started going to Sportatorium shows, like just for no apparent reason other than there's nothing to do on Saturday night except go see some show at the Sportatorium. And then there was the Button South, which had just changed from the Agora. I think it was the Agora like just before I moved there, and then it became the Button South. I mean, I've heard it was kind of superior when it was the Agora. I'm not quite sure how it changed exactly, but it was kind of a mainstream kind of rock club at that point. And then there were other little places that were cool too. The Treehouse was one of my favorites. And the Treehouse and the Button were good for me because I worked nights a lot. Again, newspaper job, you work nights. The newspaper goes to bed at midnight or later. So I'm getting off work late, and Button South was open till 6 a.m. And so was the Treehouse. So God bless Hallandale. And I was able to catch a lot of music, not all of it that great, a lot of cover bands, but the Treehouse was booking some cool stuff, some metal stuff, some punk stuff. And again, I was only there for a couple of years. Butron kind of faded and folded into 1986. So by late 86, I was back in Palm Beach, got a good job back at the Palm Beach Post where I stayed for, the next 36 years. So my initial foray into Miami and Broward was brief, but it was very influential, I think, on me. I was, a young punk metal dude, going around town, meeting people. I met a lot of cool bands. I met band members.
Are there people that you met back in that time that you're still close with today?
I'm trying to think. Not a whole lot, actually. I mean, I just run into people occasionally out and about. But I mean, you had him on the show, Pooch from Raped Ape. That'll come up shortly. But he was in a band. His band. It's a little complicated. Raped Ape had members originally from other bands that were older guys from the scene. Anyway, and I knew these older guys from the scene from that '80s metal scene in Broward. Crazy Lou Hilaire was a singer in a band called Intruder. So I knew Lou, it was just a lot of, you're just out and having fun, and you meet people and you get to know them. I had a girlfriend who knew this band called Hell Witch, and she said, "Oh, they need a place to rehearse. They're playing with Anthrax at Art Stocks. Can they use your back room?" So I let them come, and they rehearsed in my back room. Went to see them the next day, play with Anthrax. And this is another kind of precursor to all ages situation. Clubs like Art Stocks and the Button in those days, no such thing as all ages shows. So Anthrax is playing on stage, they're getting ready to go on, and they're kind of a little miffed because it's an 18 and older show, or probably 19 and older. I don't know what the age limit was. And I looked around. Oh, there's Scotty, and he's letting a bunch of kids in through the back door, so to get him into the show. So stuff like that was just starting to happen, and I was just in the right place at the right time to meet all these people, and I got to know DJs like Rick, and you just meet people when you're out in a social setting, and guys who work the door, I would talk to them, and the club owners and the magazine people, and there were a lot of cool zines. I mean, zines and record stores were sort of like the staple. That when I wasn't going to clubs, I was going to record stores and trying to build up my collection. And
I'm glad you brought that up, because there were a lot of zines and a lot of radio and things going on as well. So what are some of those other publications or even radio shows that you may have been checking out that had an influence on you?
Oh, and in the 80s, it's hard to really pinpoint. It was just kind of more like a mass assimilation. I was just taking everything in. There wasn't any. There was a zine called Zaz, I remember. Z-A-Z-Z. Chooch was in charge of that, and there was just a lot of cool little zines, and it was just more of to me, the impression was more like this is a scene. I got the feeling that this is a real music scene, and that I wanted to be part of. And I think a lot of people also got that in their blood, and it never left. But the seeds were kind of set. If it just stayed the way it was in the 80s, it would have just been another city, and any town USA would have been, there were some bands getting signed out of Florida during that period, but not a whole lot. So things really blew up in the 90s. But, when I moved back to Palm Beach, I kind of settled in my job and didn't go back to Dade and Broward that much, although I did like to go back and check out clubs and go to the Button and go to other places around the South Florida area. But what changed for me at the Post, shortly after I went back, I was working as an editor, and Scott Bennard, who is the music writer who used to write for the Sun Sentinel, he was now the music writer for the Post, and he didn't really like metal. He didn't like punk bands necessarily. He wanted to write about Springsteen, and he wanted to write about other stuff. And all these concerts are coming to town, and metal is blowing up. And he said, "Jim, would you be interested in writing about all this stuff?" He knew I was really into it. And I said, "Well, sure, I'll give it a shot." So for 2-3 years between 88 and 90, I just tallied it up. I wrote 80 stories, and a lot of concert reviews. I would get my expenses paid to go to the Sportatorium and get a nice seat in the front. So that was always nice. Of course, I had to come back and write a review.
Did you ever get backstage?
And I did do some backstage stuff, that wasn't really my thing. I wasn't really, I tried not to be kind of like a fanboy. I was more like, I wanted to be a professional. I was a professional journalist. So I kind of approached it from that angle, and I was critical. I wrote some critical reviews of people, Bon Jovi. So anyway, I started going to, a lot of shows. And then I also got to interview guys, which to me, that was the coolest thing. And it was phone interviews. They call them phoners. I guess you'd get a phone call in those days. It wasn't email. The publicity people for the tour would reach out to the local newspapers. There's the Herald, the Sentinel, and the Post. So invariably, one of those papers or more would write a story on the band. So, I was fortunate enough to interview a whole lot of different people, dozens of different guys, like Tom Hamilton from Aerosmith, Lars Ulrich from Metallica, members of the Cult and Heart, and, just a whole lot of different bands, Iron Maiden, it's not like, they're calling from some crazy wild party. They're very sober, very articulate, and very into their music, which again, it sort of opened my eyes to like the musician side of things, because I'm not a musician. I didn't, other than befriending and hanging out with musicians, I didn't have a whole lot of experience in that arena. So seeing it from another angle, seeing it from, albeit these are guys that are major rock guys on tour, but just to see it from their angle. And then, I did meet a few guys. I met KK Downing. I actually met Lars at the Bowery in West Palm Beach after the show. I didn't bother going to, because some of those after show meet and greets at the arena are just kind of you don't really get to hang out with them. You just they shuffle you through and they shuffle you out. It's sort of, I didn't really like that. I'd rather go out to the clubs after the concert. And, once in a while, the band members will come to the club. So I saw Lars at the Bowery and kind of got to meet him there. I started writing about local music, and this was another turning point. So the local scene was starting to bubble up, and there were bands that were, doing some things. The Rock City Angels come to mind. They were a Broward Dade band. I'm not sure exactly where their home base was, but those were one of those bands I saw back when I lived in Hollywood. I'd go to the clubs, and Rock City Angels would be playing Treehouse, and they were sort of like a train wreck, but they were great. They were a great train wreck, sort of like New York Dolls style punk, metal, glam, just all over the place, craziness. And they got signed to Geffen. They went to LA. There's a whole long story behind the Rock City Angels coming out of South Florida, moving to LA. Johnny Depp was in the band, and they recorded an album in Memphis. And Geffen released a double album in 80s, was it 87, 88? So I got a call from the publicity people, and I said, sure, definitely, I want to do this story. Oh, and she said, oh, by the way, Bobby Durango, the singer, he'll be down there, and his parents live in Palm Beach County. So, I lucked into that story. I went and met Bobby at his parents' house. I don't think he remembered me from the Hollywood days, but we ended up, really hitting it off. And after the interview, I offered to drive him around and take him around to the club. So we spent like an entire evening going from Palm Beach to Broward to Dade. We went all the way down to Churchill's that night, I think, and back. And, he had a great time, hanging out with his old boys. And he'd cleaned up at that point, and things were looking good for the band. And unfortunately, it kind of got derailed at some point. They didn't really do a whole lot, at least on the major label level at that point. But
right. Was Churchill's a place that you frequented at all too?
I think at that point, that was probably the early days of Churchill's. Much later, I got, hooked on Churchill's. Okay. So, but in the early days, it was sort of just one of those alternative venues that came around. But it was a cool place for sure. So back in Palm Beach, there were not a whole lot of places. There was the Rock and Roll Cafe. Besides the Bowery, there were, just a few holes in the wall, nothing great. But, what was happening is that the whole notion of all ages shows and having concerts at alternative venues was bubbling up, even higher, and it reached Palm Beach. So I went to I think it was like a teen center or a rec center or a community center of some sort. And I saw a band called Raped Ape. And they were like amazing. I thought all the bands that I saw at this venue were great. And this was, late 80s. Thrash metal was happening. A lot of crossover punk metal was happening. Venues that were not clubs were starting to book shows. And this caught my attention. I wrote some stories about it. I didn't really give it a whole lot of thought until, a couple years later, my stories in the paper sort of kind of faded at that point. They didn't need me to write rock and metal stories anymore. So I went back to my editing job. And I kept in touch with Raped Ape, and they needed a manager, and they asked me, and they knew me from, from the newspaper, and I knew the older guys in the band, and I ended up taking on duties as a personal manager for a band. And that's sort of when I really officially stepped into the local music scene, in my opinion. I think everything else was just working up to this point, but now I was officially in. So
what was different about that experience at being a manager of a band?
There's a lot of hassle. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily, but it was fun. It was a really satisfying experience to help these guys, do something with their music, which was, I thought this needs wider exposure. They're playing these little venues, and I started booking them into bigger clubs and getting them bigger gigs, and one thing led to another, and they're getting invited to play showcases like Miami Rocks and playing alongside the Mavericks and Marilyn Manson, and the scene itself was just kind of exploding in every direction. It was hard to see coming. I didn't see it coming, but I was kind of isolated in Palm Beach, I guess. I didn't see what was happening in Broward and Dade in the early 90s or late 80s, but it really was bubbling up, and it kind of just exploded.
Why do you think that explosion happened when it did?
Well, I have a theory, and I kind of sketches that on paper. I have to look at it. But just from my experience, this is totally anecdotal, but, going back to the 70s and 80s, there was always different splintered music scenes. You had your your old rock and roll scene, you had your new wave or punk scene, you had your metal scene. They were all kind of separate and isolated, doing their own thing. Some were on the way up, some were on the way down. Sometime around the 90s, everything kind of coalesced. I think every scene was strong. Every scene's either, some were still on the way down, but some were on the way up. And it was just all of a sudden, everything was happening at the same time, whether it was a blues or even jazz, and metal and punk and hardcore, you name it. The magazines responded, because there was such a healthy scene, it helped the clubs, and the clubs proliferated, and the zines proliferated, and the record stores proliferated. It just kind of fed off of one another, and it's sort of like an organism that just kind of grew out of itself, I think, because of all these different musical genres. It really was an eclectic scene at the time. And, it kind of opened my eyes to a lot of different styles of music. So, from being a manager of a thrash metal band, people wouldn't think, oh, this guy doesn't appreciate other kinds of music, but I tried. And Raped Ape was also open-minded about who they played with and what they did. And they weren't really too keen on, only playing death metal shows. And that's what was so cool when they played that show with the Mavericks. And we actually went to a showcase in Atlanta, and they played the same stage as Cowboy Mouth. And, it was just sort of like a different music scene. It was, the days of the alternative press, and alternative radio and alternative everything. This is when it came about. It probably started elsewhere sooner than Florida, but South Florida kind of really took off in that time period. You had Saigon Kick coming out, and you name it. There's a laundry list of bands that came out in this time frame, and just being part of the metal scene itself, or the punk metal hardcore underground scene, is kind of what I was earliest experience with. It was just sort of, it was fun. It was just a lot of fun and a lot of work, but the payoff is it's a lot of, satisfaction that you're helping and doing things and making for a better scene.
I know that Raped Ape also played a ton of shows at the Plus Five Lounge. So what are your memories of them getting booked there, and just some of your personal experiences at the Plus Five?
Plus Five actually was around as like a pool hall kind of bar, they probably just had cover bands and things coming in. But I remember the owner made a conscious decision to turn it into a club where they spotlighted original music. And he wasn't the only one. There were other clubs doing this, which is a great idea. They saw the fact that if they booked, I don't know, and Boogalard or Marilyn Manson, they'd get, 500 people in the club. The fact that these bands were drawing on off nights. I remember seeing Monday nights or Tuesday nights were local band nights at a lot of clubs. They still reserve their weekends for, their regular crowd, but they would have a local band night on Wednesday, and it would be packed. These clubs would be packed with people. And, it was just, it kind of got my attention, and I thought maybe we should be doing more, to organize the scene. So that's kind of where the Slammie Awards kind of came out of, that whole time period.
And let's talk about just the origins of all that. The Slammie.
Well, that's where the name comes from. That's where kind of it all started. And, it turns out 25 years later, I finally closed the book on doing shows after the first Slammie Awards was in 92. And the last show I did as a promoter, as a Slammie promoter, was 2017. So that was a long time to be doing concerts. I think I counted something like 700 bands I promoted over the year. But it all started with the Slammie Awards in 1992 because, the scene, like I said, it was a great scene. There's the flyer. Yeah. The Tampa area had something called the Tampa Bay Metal Awards. And of course, Tampa Bay Metal, it was sort of like a national phenomenon. Tampa had a lot of cool stuff going on. And I thought South Florida, we were just as good as Tampa. Maybe not, but we had more eclectic scene than Tampa had. We also had something called the South Florida Rock Awards, which is a big showcase for bands. Raped Ape played, and a lot of Manson played, and Boogalard played. A lot of bands were playing the Rock Awards, and they were drawing huge crowds. So I thought, well, wait a minute, why don't we just do a focused event on metal, hardcore, punk scene? And I don't know where I came up with Slammie. I mean, it's a play on Grammy Awards, obviously. And slam dancing was sort of in the news a lot in those days. Clubs were like not very happy about having slam dancing at shows. A lot of them banned it. You go to a club, there'd be a sign hanging on the stage, no slam dancing. It's sort of like, it's kind of a joke now when you think about it, but back then it was real. There was very few places you could actually slam to at a concert, unless it was like at an arena or something. It was actually originally supposed to be at Summers on the Beach. I have an old flyer that before this one that says the first annual Slammie's at Summers on the Beach. But Summers had issues, and I think they might even have closed at that point. So I went to the Button South, and somehow I don't know how. Maybe it was my association with Raped Ape and I was friendly with the Button South people. They let us do it. So I got some of the biggest metal bands from the scene. Malevolent Creation had just released, I think it was their second album, and Raped Ape played. Solstice, who was signed to a label, also played. Cynic was actually supposed to play, and they ended up going on tour. So Solstice stepped in. I mean, Cynic would have been great to have as well. And then as the opening band, I got this little band called Load, and they blew the roof off the place. People were a little nervous. Oh, Load going on stage playing in front of this huge metal crowd. We had like 1,000 people were there. Load just killed it. So, it was off to a roaring start. So, we did 8 more Slammie Awards after that. No more at the Button South. They banned slam dancing. The city of Hallandale, like a week later, they had a city meeting, and the headlines, slam dancing banned in city of Hallandale. So we moved on. We ended up, the next year that was at the +5.
Did they ban slam dancing because of just people getting injured? Like was there a lot of that going on?
Well, I don't think it was just, there was any real reason for it. There was a cover story in it wasn't New Times. Before New Times, there were some other weekly magazines that were really covering the scene closely. And I think it was a cover story in the local magazine that, on the Slammie Awards, and pictures of people in the mosh pit. And I don't know, Hallandale just was a little uptight, but you'd think if they were keeping their bars open till 6 a.m., they wouldn't be that uptight about slam dancing. But, we were done. When we did these kinds of shows, it was, we were in and out. We were done. We didn't stay there all night long. There wasn't a lot of trouble, but I guess there was enough trouble and enough violence for them to flag it. But anyway, that's not the first time where, city governments crack down on rock and roll. Yeah, there you go. But it was great publicity. So I took that publicity and ran with it. I wasn't really crazy about doing the event at the Button anyway. So the +5 was great the next year. Marilyn Manson won the award, I think, for Band of the Year. And Saigon Kick won the award for National Release. And Brian Warner, a.k.a. Marilyn Manson, is up on stage presenting the award for Saigon Kick, and nobody is there to accept it, unfortunately, and the people are booing Saigon Kick. So wouldn't you know it, Brian throws their award trophy into the crowd where it's smashed in the mosh pit. So that was a great, one of those seminal moments of the Slammies. That was at the +5. It came back to haunt Mr. Manson years later. I think 3 years later, they had become a national phenomenon, and their album won Album of the Year at the Slammies. And someone's up on stage presenting the award and Manson's not there and he's getting booed. So what goes around comes around. Nobody smashed his award, though. I made sure that he got it. I don't know if he still has it. I don't know if anybody still has their awards. They were these little skull. They're actually pretty big. They're sort of like these skulls, but like bigger version of this. And it had a award plate on right on the front of the forehead that said, 1992 South Florida Slammie Awards, Band of the Year or Thrash Band or Metal Band. We gave away a lot of awards in those days. So it was just a lot of fun. It was very fulfilling to kind of promote the scene from that angle. I know, there was a lot of cool stuff going on musically, but I think the thrash, metal, punk, alternative, underground part of the scene was not getting the respect and recognition it deserved. And it definitely had the fans. I mean, the fans were amazing. Every year we had, close to 1,000 people at those Slammies. After the second year, it got so big, we had to move it to the Edge. That's when the Edge was sort of taking over as the club in downtown Fort Lauderdale. It's still there as Revolution.
Right.
But the Edge is where we had the biggest Slammie Award shows, with Marilyn Manson headlining in '94.
What was it like behind the scenes putting something like this on? Did you have people that were helping you? If so, who were some of those folks that were lending a hand as you were putting something like this on?
Well, I had a lot of people, and this is where my years of schmoozing people pays off, where, first of all, I didn't want it to be my awards. I didn't want it to be Jim Hayward's Slammie Awards or Jim Hayward decides who's the best band or anything like that. I wanted, first of all, it was open ballot. Well, most of them were open ballot. Some years we had names on the ballot. We went back and forth. I think the first year was an open ballot, and it was hard to count every ballot. So we started trying to figure out, let's put 5 or 6 or 7 bands in each category. And to do that, I needed people that I could trust that they were part of the scene. So radio DJs, people who worked in record stores, people who wrote for magazines, other promoters. I would get a group of people together to be sort of like the committee. We all sat down, and these were the days where I remember meeting Steve Rollman, who's still a crucial member of the scene with Pure Honey. In the early days, Steve was a major help. He was a DJ and did a lot of things for the scene. Bob Slade in Miami was a very crucial member of my team, and just people from all parts of the scene. I would kind of weasel their time and their efforts, and I would have them DJ the show, and those guys were helpful in the planning process. And one thing led to another, and through this process, I started meeting people like Bob and other promoters, and they said, "Hey Jim, maybe you should start promoting some national shows. There's a lot of national acts are coming through South Florida now," and they were recognizing I was doing such a great job organizing the Slammies that I started in '94. I started doing national acts as well as the Slammie Awards, but the Slammies took up a lot of time. I mean, I had crew members that were like working for me for Raped Ape, and they were working on the Slammies, and you needed security, you needed all these things, and I wanted it to be done right. I wanted it to be a cool event. We had merchandise wise, we had our own T-shirts. So this was the first Slammie Awards shirt, and that's the logo that Pooch designed. Pooch from Raped Ape. And I saw this even before I had the idea for the Slammies. I said, "Pooch, that's perfect as a logo. It's got guitars, drums, microphone." And then, the back with the event. And we did shirts every year for 6 years. So here's the second one, +5 shirt. I don't know why I did white, but there's the back with all the bands that played that night. Collapsing Lungs got signed right after this. I wouldn't say because of this, but they were already on their way up. It was cool to get these bands on stage, to showcase South Florida music. And one after another, they were getting signed and going on tour and doing bigger and better things.
Were the Slammies at this point bringing out people from record labels to scout some of these Florida bands?
That was not really the purpose of it. I didn't make that a focus. I'm sure there were, just by the nature of the event. I wanted the event to be more like a big party for us, for the scene, for the people that came to the scene. As a fan, I wanted to be, and I continued to do this as much as I could. I wanted it to be something that I would enjoy as a fan. I didn't necessarily want to be a schmooze fest for record labels or even for the bands themselves. I just wanted the people that came to the show to have a great time, and we would give away all kinds of merchandise. Every record label or record store I could finagle freebies out of. When you came to the show, you got free stuff. We threw free stuff out on stage. It was just everything I could think of. I tried to cover all my bases. For the most part, until we got to the Edge, who had decent security. A lot of clubs didn't really have great security in those days. They didn't understand, especially slam dancing events. They didn't understand. So I got guys from the scene to come in and provide security because I knew them and I trusted them. And I continued to do this for many years. I promoted it myself, but I also tried to loop in as many of my friends in radio and the magazine. So we got voluminous press for the event. And I don't know. It's just I was kind of riding the crest of the wave of the scene, which was great. It was great. It was great to be part of that. And the awards themselves, I didn't take. Some people took it seriously, but I don't think it was sort of tongue in cheek. I think people didn't get that. It's not a big deal. Who cares who wins the award? It's just fun to do it. I think when you're doing that kind of an award, we really didn't take it seriously. Although we counted them seriously, I made sure it was done, on the up and up. There was no cheating or no stacking the ballot or anything
Was there
stupid.
ever any backlash from anyone in the scene who felt they were excluded from it?
Well, I don't know. You hear the old saying, oh, it's just a popularity contest. Oh, of course it is. That's what it is. It's not. There were some great bands with great musicians that I admired and loved, and I just felt that they didn't have the crowd or the draw or the ability to whip up a mosh pit to play the Slammie Awards. Picking the bands, I had to pick bands that were popular in the scene and would get a good crowd there and everyone would like, and it would be, it's, them when you see them, it's not hard. It's like, different new bands were coming out, Shai Hulud, Strong Arm, bands that you think, oh, these are not metal, but they're heavy duty, great straight edge hardcore bands, and they played the Slammies. A lot of bands played the Slammies. I tried to open my field of vision when the scene developed. When we moved the Slammies to Squeeze after the Edge. I think the Edge might even have. I don't think they closed. We just had a smaller year, '97. So I had a ska band, King 7 and the Soul Sonics played the Slammies that year, and they were great. It became more of an eclectic event. In '98 or '99, it was in '98. Further Seems Forever with Chris Carrabba on vocals played the Slammie Awards, and they went over great, playing in between two metal-oriented bands. So it's just a matter of spotlighting the edgier side of the music scene is what it developed into at the time. It might have started in '92 as sort of like a metal kind of thing, but I think over the years the Slammies really developed into just recognizing I call it hard alternative or alternative punk metal, whatever you want to call it. That's what it was in the '90s, and it was just cool to be part of it.
I think the Slammie Awards from 1996 was the first one that I can remember where there was a band that came from outside of Florida, Biohazard, whose idea was to bring them down, and what did that do to change, or perhaps it didn't affect the Slammies that year?
I think it was kind of like a stopgap measure, but it was also the last year we did Slammies at the Edge, and the Edge, like it still is today, it was even bigger. I think back in those days, they closed put up some walls and changed the venue. It was like 1,500 people. It was a monstrous venue. And to make an event work there, you had to have 1,000 people or thereabouts in the building. You know, you couldn't have a half empty building. So I had the opportunity to book Biohazard. I was doing national shows at this point, and Biohazard just happened to be touring right at the same time. And it just kind of worked out that way. The Jenna Torturers headlined the year before, and they're from Tampa. They're not really a South Florida band either. So I don't think it was a major step away, you know, to bring in a band like Biohazard to play that year. I made sure I just stack it with a bunch of cool local bands like Radio Baghdad, Nonpoint. That was their first major exposure, I think, as Nonpoint, and they're still going strong. They're another one of those bands I'm very proud to see still out there playing. And they got their start in the early days of the South Florida scene. Rob, the drummer from Nonpoint, actually first contacted me via mail. He probably doesn't remember this. When he lived in Puerto Rico, he started the band in Puerto Rico in the late 80s or early 90s, and he joined the Raped Ape fan club by mail. And I got this letter from a guy named Rob Rivera from Puerto Rico. Yeah, I'm starting a band. I like Raped Ape. We're going to move to South Florida. So, you know, here we go. Here we are. Nonpoint's still on tour.
Wow. That's an interesting story. So did you get a chance to see them play at all when they were Nonpoint Factor?
Yes, yeah, quite a few times. Yeah, they were kind of working out the kinks. They were hardworking guys. I mean, it's no surprise that they're still hardworking guys. I think Rob might be the only one left from the early original lineup, but you could see them developing as the scene developed too. They were sort of like many bands. They were kind of absorbing what was going on, and I think that's what a lot of people don't recognize. It's not a competition when you have so many. When you're surrounded by great musicians, it raises the level of musicianship just across the board. There is competition. I mean, obviously, it's you mentioned it earlier. There's bands that kind of get left out and you know aren't happy about it. But the good news is it kind of raises the level of competition for everybody, and the level of quality in the musicianship is just crazy. When after the third year, after 94, there were so many good bands, and the other thing that was going on in those days, we haven't talked about it, is demo tapes. I mean, this was the era of demo tapes and tape trading, and everybody had a great demo, and CDs were just coming out. So early 90s, bands were able to put out their own CDs, which kind of changed the game a little bit. You could put out a CD and we'd be a lot more respected than just having a demo tape. But the demo tape days, I kind of miss that. It was so fun. I remember Peaches used to stock demo tapes in every store. You could go to any Peaches store and there'd be a whole wall of demo tapes from every local band. Like you go to the Peaches in Boca, oh, there's some demo tapes from bands in Boca that you never heard of, or go to the Peaches in South Miami. I would make the rounds of all these stores because I was promoting the Slammies and Raped Ape. And I actually met, I don't remember if he remembers me or I met him there, but Brian, Mr. Manson, worked at the Peaches in Boca. So that's where I first ran into, who's this guy? You know, oh, he's starting a band called Marilyn Manson. So yeah.
What did you think of some of their early demos?
The Manson demos were cool. I mean, there was definitely nobody was doing anything like that, what they were doing. I prefer that they had a drummer. So when they added a drummer somewhere in the early days, that was a big improvement in my mind. And they added a very good drummer and a very good guitarist. And, you know, it was not, it was nothing to sneeze at. Their music was great and they deserve everything they got. It was kind of a meteoric rise out of the South Florida underground, you know, like many bands. I remember seeing them play clubs, and next thing you know, they're opening for Nine Inch Nails, which is another crazy story. I guess I should tell this one. So when did their album come out? 94, I guess. The Portrait of an American Family, they toured with Nine Inch Nails. And they played the Miami Arena opening for Nails, and Jim Rose Circus was the opening before Manson, I believe. I can't remember. I got there late. I missed Jim Rose Circus, but I saw Manson play, and it was a crazy show, all kinds of shenanigans going on stage. Nine Inch Nails was great in those days. And this is one of those shows where I definitely wanted to go backstage, and I got an invite to the Manson backstage dressing room. John Tovar, R.I.P., another crony of mine that we've lost recently. He was still managing Manson at this point. So I don't know if this was a good idea or not, but they invited like all the family, like there were family members there from the band, Marilyn Manson's family, and maybe Tovar invited some family friends. This was like not a totally edgy crowd by any means. We were just kind of hanging out in the dressing room and having a few drinks. And I was talking to John, and all of a sudden, Mr. Lifto from Jim Rose Circus bursts into the room. I don't know if you remember Mr. Lifto from Jim Rose Circus. His claim to fame is he would lift things. He would lift things with a stud that was in his penis. So as a performer, do what you want. I have no qualms about what he does. Be creative. But he in the middle of this party, I'm sitting there with my girlfriend, and there's Mr. Lifto. We just keep talking. He jumps up on a table and takes a Marilyn Manson lunchbox and attaches it and starts swinging it around with his appendage. So this Marilyn Manson lunchbox is swinging around. The family members in the room, like their jaws drop, and I'm getting ready for this lunchbox to come flying off and whack somebody in the head. And I looked at my girlfriend, and I thought, well, maybe we should be going now. So I don't know what happened next, but was the craziness that happened at that event.
I would say that does not happen in not every show.
No.
So,
but I can imagine touring with Jim Rose Circus and Marilyn Manson would be kind of a fun tour to go on.
Yeah.
Back to Manson and his early days. Much like Nonpoint, and this is a lesson for most bands. You just work hard. You put in the work. I remember seeing him when his band was nothing, when they were just starting out. I would see him everywhere promoting. He would have a stack of flyers. I saw Brian outside an Iron Maiden concert that I was reviewing for the paper. He was just outside the Miami Arena passing out Marilyn Manson flyers at an Iron Maiden show. So, you leave no stone unturned. You promote.
I know you mentioned John Tovar. Did you have any other stories, Jim, as far as some of your partnerships with John, or just different times you may have worked together or just may have interacted?
Well, yeah, John was great. I sat on a couple industry panels with him, like at the Southeast Music Conference in Tampa. I remember that. Maybe Miami Rocks too. He might have been in on that panel. And he was just mutual respect for me and John. I mean, we couldn't have been as different as you can imagine, but we hit it off, and he had a great deal of respect for me, and I had a great deal of respect for him. And my favorite, I don't want to make light of anything, but fun stories are fun. So my fun John Tovar stories. John had a affliction where he would fall asleep. Was it narcolepsy? So and I heard about this, but I didn't think about it much, because every time I saw John in public, everything was normal. We were at a showcase on South Beach. I think it was Washington Square. And Boogalard or somebody was on stage playing as loud as you could possibly imagine. Like my ears were ringing. I look over at John, and he's asleep at the bar. He just nodded off. But that's not on purpose. He had an issue with that. But it was just, John, wake up. Okay, we're good. But I was looking back here. And Boogalard actually won 10 awards over the years, and Load won 10. I think Load's longevity at the Slammies was great. They played multiple times. Marilyn Manson won 9. over the years. And the Grooveniks won 8, they were kind of in the tail end of the 96, 7, 8, 9 Slammies. Those were the years the Grooveniks kind of came to the fore and became a force in the scene. Raped Ape won 7. Nonpoint, Jack Off Jill. Jack Off Jill was another band from the scene that was doing a lot of things. So yeah, the Slammies, I try to recognize those bands. I mean, even if you didn't win awards, it was still cool to have them there and have them recognized. Like I said, it wasn't really about the award itself, but nominating great musicians, I like to do that too. There were so many great drummers in South Florida. So just having to see the list of drummer nominations, was always cool. But for the Slammie Awards, we ended up doing the last 2 at Foo Bar in Fort Lauderdale, which is a club where I was doing shows with my partner Grant, and it just happened to be the best venue to do those last 2 Slammies. We're a little smaller. We were down to about 400 people or 500 people, but they were still cool shows. I mean, Puya had just gotten signed. They were great. Another band that came out of South Florida, and Quit, who I've always wanted to have on the show. So I finally got Quit to play that year, and Nonpoint again, right before they were signed. So the scene was still strong. And then the following year, I think, is when Further Seems Forever played. But yeah, I have great memories of all 8 years of doing the Slammies. It was a lot of work, and people asked why I stopped, and it was just, I think it kind of ran its course. It seems to me it should stay in the 90s. It was a 90s thing. Doing a Slammie Awards in the year 2000 just didn't seem right. So what I did is I moved on and created a new event in 2000 called it La Fiesta de Punk Rock. And we did that not necessarily as a replacement for the Slammies, but as a big showcase for local music. We did that 3 years in a row, or 3 out of 4 years at the Chili Pepper, which is what the Edge became before it became Revolution. So the punk rock scene was in its heyday at this point. So the La Fiesta became a very cool way to spotlight the local punk scene, Newfound Glory specifically, and Against All Authority and Further Seems Forever, and you name it. We had a lot of great bands play La Fiesta. And I just kind of took a different approach with this event. Again, I came up with that name. I can't imagine why. I know it had to do with the Chili Pepper. It's a Chili Pepper. Let's do kind of a theme event. And we had a piñata. All the merchandise, instead of just throwing the merchandise out at the crowd and beating people in the head like we used to do at the Slammies, I had the merchandise all in a big piñata, and people would smash the piñata to get the free merch. So
who was responsible for the poster art?
That's Chuck Luce. That's classic Chuck Luce, and he's done a lot of great posters over the year. I don't know if this was, I think this was the 3rd year. This was another, and he did more of a Day of the Dead kind of imagery on this one. It was kind of cool. It was great to use great artists like Chuck to do flyers. The Slammies was more of a underground kind of slapdash kind of flyer situation. But by 2000, the scene had kind of matured. We were a more mature scene. We had sophisticated flyers and posters, and it was a real scene at that point. It wasn't just a wannabe scene. It was, it was great to be, involved. And at that point I was 3 or 4 years into doing national acts. So, Against All Authority, Newfound Glory, obviously getting signed, the Crumbs, again, same scenario. I was trying to spotlight the best of the new bands and, the local scene at the time. And it was outdoors too. That was the other thing. It was on that back patio. So it was kind of an outdoor festival. It's sort of also kind of my reaction to the summer festivals that were popular across the country. So we had our own little punk rock festival for the local scene.
Did you feel like the crowds were also changing over the years since you started this so early on in the early 90s, and as it's starting to grow, did you feel like the audience had shifted in terms of just the types of people who would come out to some of those shows?
Well, they definitely became younger. I mean, and that's a byproduct of what I was talking about, is just opening the doors to all ages. And that was, again, that was a part of working with the clubs and finding clubs and convincing clubs that doing all ages shows was the right thing to do. And not all of them did it. You mentioned Churchill's. We could never do an all ages show ever at Churchill's. There was probably in the history of Churchill's, there's a handful of all ages shows. So that was something, but I understood it was the logistics. You couldn't just close down the bar for the night and lose all that income. So, we had to work with venues to do certain things and have the bar in another room or secluded from the kids or the younger people, and different clubs in different cities and different counties. It was all different. So it was a lot of work to work with the venues to get all ages, but we tried our best. And it was driven by not just the crowd it was driven by the bands themselves. The bands wanted everybody to come see them. They didn't want to exclude people from their performances. So, and I could definitely, see that. And, it just comes in waves. It's sort of like the older crowd from the 90s sort of morphed into the younger crowd in the 2000s. And then it's kind of come back around where, a lot of those guys that were teens back in those days are now the old timers in the scene. So
There was another venue. I don't know how long it was around for, Club Impact, but you had booked a show there where Korn and Machines of Love and Grace played.
oh yeah, that was a crazy show. One of my very early shows. I was starting to do national acts, and Fat Harry Tyler in Orlando was booking some bigger acts like Korn, and he needed a venue in South Florida, so I partnered with him on that one. And Korn was kind of just starting out. I think the show might have been booked even before Korn's album came out. I don't know if you remember, Korn's first album kind of just blew up and kind of ushered in the new metal wave that came after. But at the time, well, Korn, I knew who they were. They toured with Megadeth or somebody, but we couldn't find a good venue. But we found Club Impact. It ended up being Millennium. They changed their name to Millennium, and then they changed the name to something else. And it was a decent place. It was a big venue, probably held about 800 people, 1,000. But we didn't know Korn was going to be as huge as they became. So we put tickets on sale, and all of a sudden that sells out, and we're selling more tickets at the door, and the place is huge. It's like we had to turn people away to that show. There's so many people. And this is one of those shows back in the early days when I didn't trust the club security. So I had my own security. Guys from the scene were up there. I remember skinny Pete Carmichael from the Groovenicks, the bass player who couldn't weigh more than 140 pounds. He's up there as stage security with this monstrous 1,000-person crowd, looming on top of him. But he did a great job. I had some guys from the scene were always great to have security. Another story I can remember along those lines is we did another club. Again, it was kind of a sketchy club in the same area, the House of Rock in Pompano. I did Guttermouth there. I did a few other shows there, and they let us do all ages because they had a bar in a separate room, and it was fine, except their security sucked. So I had to get my own security. And then a band called Snot played there. I can't remember exactly. Snot was kind of well known in the underground at the time. Their singer passed away, I believe. But
they opened for Machine Head.
Yeah. But some of the punk guys were really into Snot. And I had Chad from Newfound Glory and Mike Hurley from Tension were working security, I remember that night. And I was watching the show, and like Mike and Chad were really into Snot. So they would, in addition to their duties for security, they would jump on stage and grab the microphone and do backing vocals like throughout the whole show. And I remember the singer from Snot stopped the show and he says, "Hey man, I want to thank you guys. You guys have the coolest security I've ever seen." Not knowing that these two guys are singers from local punk bands. So right. Mike Hurley, we another RIP. Sadly, we lost Mike, the singer from Tension.
Right.
And Tension was such a great band. I put them as the lead-off track on the Slammie Awards CD, which came out in 5 after the third year. And I do have like thousands of these CDs still somewhere in my garage. So I'm going to be putting them up on the website so you can, people can order them. There's, besides Tension, there's a great Load song on there, Jack Off Jill, Raped Ape, Malevolent Creation, and Booglard. There's a whole lot of bands from that 90s scene, not necessarily the 2000 scene, but the 90s scene on that Slammie CD that I want to, hopefully people will pick that up, because a lot of that music, it's only on the CD. I don't know if some of them might not be streaming, some of those older songs. There's even an old Nonpoint factor on there.
There is. And I think about around this time, and I want to say the first time where a website for the Slammies was on the 97 Slammie Awards flyer. And it was one of those old like AOL hometown websites. So as the internet is also starting to pick up as the 90s rolled on, how much of an impact did that have on the way that you were starting to promote shows?
I hate to say it had a negative impact. It probably had a negative impact. But I think in a more general sense, I mean, it was nice to be able to email my press releases to people and not have to fax them, because I used to fax everything. I would use my Palm Beach Post. I'm retired now, so I can admit this. I would use the fax at the Palm Beach Post, the fax machine, and fax out my press releases. And you had to, physically do things, mail things, and in a way that, besides the faxing, a lot of those things back in the day were great. Going to record stores and actually promoting shows via record stores. The internet radically changed all of that eventually. But in the early days of the internet, it wasn't really. It was just kind of a minor thing, the way it was. I think I tried to have online voting that last year. I can't remember how well that went, but yeah, the internet later changed things for the worse. I mean, depends on how you look at it. I mean, it enabled a lot of new bands to record and release music, but we're talking decades later. Back in the early days, it wasn't that at all. And especially with like the hardcore punk metal scene, the internet really didn't impact it too much in the beginning. In the early days, it was sort of, we just kind of went on with the way we were doing things. But having computers and having, like I was saying, all those great posters and flyers and designers, I wanted to give a shout out, besides Chuck, to some of the other guys who did work on some of my. Adam Forst was a cool guy that used to do a lot of flyers and posters. Guys like Nick Dewey, Eric Richmont. There's probably more that I'm forgetting, but whenever I needed a cool flyer or poster, that's what you did. That's how you separated. And what I was trying to do with Slammie, especially, is a consistent thing, a message, a branding. I mean, I didn't think of it that way, but putting the Slammie brand on concerts, I wanted people to know that this was a cool concert. It was going to be done right. You're not going to get killed going to this show. It's, we're trying our best to make sure this is it says all ages punk show, but it says Slammie, and it's going to be cool. So that was my intention, and kind of push it in that direction. So no matter who I was working with, I had a lot of partners over the years, whether I was doing a show with Fat Harry or with Grant Hall, who I later became a prolific partnership. We did over 200 shows together between, I don't know what it was, 2002 and 2005. Doing those shows with other partners, I would kind of shape it into a Slammie event and make sure that, the bands were good, and that I was booking through national booking agents. I would, follow through with everything I could to make sure, what I was doing was a great event. And it all goes back to just being a fan of the music. I just wanted to, see a good show.
Was there ever any contention between other promoters in the scene or other management and that sort of thing that created some negative waves from your experiences?
Oh, always. That goes with the territory. I mean, I kind of let it slide off my back. I mean, it's easy to let it get to you. I always had a day job. I always had my journalism career. So for me, I didn't take any of that too seriously. People who are into the scene and working in the scene as their livelihood, I can see that, you take it more seriously. You should. I mean, I wouldn't say I didn't take it seriously. I took the music business and my participation in it very seriously. I just didn't let the criticism get to me. I try to address any issues people brought up. There's always something. You can't please everybody. So, we did our best. We went to great lengths to do things that other promoters didn't do. I worked with many different promoters and picked up many different tips and tricks. And, even when I didn't have my own security, I always had a guy on stage that was sort of my eye on stage, and my own crew. You bring in your own crew. I had a guy named Chris Bones Bentall, who is sort of like my stage manager at a lot of events, and he was great at spotting problems from the stage. He would just lurk on the side of the stage, and he'd look out into the crowd, and he would point people out. He said, that guy's trouble. He knew people from the scene. So we had, the ability to kind of keep trouble from happening before it happens. You don't wait for trouble to happen at a show. You kind of have to take prohibitive action. One of the smart things we did at the Factory, which is a club in Fort Lauderdale that we did a lot of shows at, I did a lot of shows there with Grant. And we knew from experience, you're going to get troublemakers coming to a show. So what we did is we just hired an off-duty cop, and he sat at the door. He did nothing except sit at the door at every single show. And believe it or not, we rarely had problems at the Factory. And I definitely credit this to the off-duty cop just sitting there, because guys would come to the show and they'd see that cop and they'd know if they did anything stupid, the cop's going to arrest them. So they didn't do anything stupid. So that was one way to address that. Yeah, the Factory was fun. It was one of those venues that it used to be Rosebuds back in the 80s or 90s. And then they changed ownership, and we were in and out of a lot of clubs. I think the Factory only lasted 4 years, but we did hundreds of shows there. And it was just available, and they were willing to work with us and able to do all ages shows. And it was like the heyday. We were in the right place at the right time. The Factory was definitely a prolific venue. Let me see here. I have a list of all the clubs, and over the years, I didn't count how many shows I did at each venue because it's just too many. There's like 400 shows, so I can't really count that. But what I did count is how many years, like over 17 years at Respectable Street. That's by far my most reliable, trustworthy club you could always count on was Respectable Street. Churchill's too. Churchill's for its longevity. I mean, as the years went by and clubs fell by the wayside, there's certain clubs you could count on, and those are the two that stick in my mind. But there were years there where we were doing tons of shows. Ovation in Boynton Beach was another one. It was just a big old supermarket. I think it was a Publix or a Winn-Dixie, and they gutted the place and turned it into a big club, and it failed miserably. So they turned to us to do shows there, and I was booking shows with partners, typically Grant, some with Fat Harry, like Slayer. There was the Rollins Band Black Flag event there was very cool. NoFX was one of my favorite shows to book at Ovation. Just working with NoFX, it was unlike any other band.
Did you feel like for a show like Slayer, you had to beef up the security, or was it just business as usual?
Yeah, there's special shows. When you get to a certain point, you hire a company to do. When you have shows like that, you hire a security company, licensed, bonded, and we had to do that on multiple occasions. You have to bite the bullet and pay money, a lot of money to have security and the right staging, the right sound and lights. It's like you do what's appropriate when it's a certain kind of show. But that gets added into the budget. That's why people wonder, why is the ticket $20, $30? Well, that's because all these production values. On the other side of the coin, one of my favorite shows ever to do was, I don't know if you have this up, but the Fugazi show, I pretty much just did that myself with Ian because they wanted a $6 ticket. And the only way to do a $6 ticket on a show at the Chili Pepper is to cut every corner you can imagine and just wing it. You know, it's like, that was the poster. I made it myself. I didn't pay anybody to make a poster. I didn't pay anybody to do anything except I paid Fugazi and I paid the Chili Pepper, and it almost sold out. It was a huge show. And I worked with Ian, and this is the way he works. You know, that's the way Fugazi toured. Cheap ticket, you know, for sure. No extravagances. We just happened to be in the right situation where I had a good relationship with the Chili Pepper, and they had some big event the night before. I can't remember what it was. It might have been, it was definitely a mainstream band that had a huge PA, like a massive professional PA that we were able to keep in the building and use for Fugazi. So that saved some money. And then Fugazi pulls up in their, I think it wasn't even a van. It was probably just a car pulling a trailer. And I helped Ian load out. It was just me and him loading out equipment. They get on stage with minimal equipment. So, you know, there's two sides of the coin. It's like, I can see both sides. Like, you want a massive, if you're Slayer, you want a massive, you know, PA and sound and spectacle. But if you're Fugazi, you don't need all that crap. And that's why I kind of enjoy doing those punk shows. In my later years, I started getting away from metal and enjoyed the punk shows a lot more. Bouncing Souls, those guys I got to know, and they were great. There was one event at Ovation, and the thing with these punk shows, though, is the opposite problem of slam dancing. There wasn't that problem. There was the problem of everybody jumping on stage. The bands encouraged it. They wanted people on stage. So especially Bouncing Souls, Dropkick Murphys, Guttermouth, all those bands I booked multiple times. And it was a free-for-all. At the end of the night, you know, you'd had 50 people on stage dancing around. There was one show at Ovation, or maybe it was still Orbit at that point. I remember just watching this chaos on stage, and the equipment was like teetering and tottering. And I was standing there holding the microphone for Greg so he could sing without getting the microphone knocked into his head, you know, while he was singing the final song. But those are fun. I mean, it's a fun crowd. It's definitely not a destructive, you know, crowd that's going to tear the place up or cause problems. So the all ages punk shows, especially the pop punk, when that became popular, it was a cool show to promote. As a promoter, I was a little older at that point, but I still enjoyed it. I wasn't into the music as much, but those are fun bands to work with, you know, and then emo happened, and then Dashboard Confessional happened, and that was a whole different story. Yeah.
I know you had mentioned at the start of our episode that a lot of people may not have known you by face. So when these shows were going on, where would you typically be when bands would be playing?
It really depends. I was all over the place. It depends on the venue and depends on the situation. I was rarely working the door. The bigger shows, we had people working for us at the door, or the club working the door. So the factory, you usually saw Grant at the door. People saw Grant a lot and then thought Grant was me, but Grant was Grant. And Grant was great. He was sort of like, we were the yin and the yang. Like, he did some things really well. I did other things really well. And together, I couldn't have done half of those shows without him, and he couldn't have done half without me. So we were sort of like working together. And Grant did a lot of shows on his own as well. Not people might not know that. Some of those shows that were Slammie shows were actually just Grant, and I didn't even show up. If it was just a small show and the profit's only $200, and I don't want to take half of his money on the Grant was doing this for a living. You know, I didn't need the money, you know, luckily. So at other shows, I was always inside somewhere watching the headliner, usually behind the soundboard or somewhere safe, or oftentimes, unfortunately, the way things work, I was in the office doing paperwork and settling shows and paying people and taking care of the books. And that's an unfortunate side effect of being the man in charge. The Newfound Glory show at the Coral Springs Sportsplex, probably the biggest show I ever did. thousands and thousands. I don't know what we had, 2,500, 3,000, 4,000. We had so many people at that show. It was such an endeavor to do. I missed most of the show because I was in an office just taking care of so many details. I managed to get out there and see Newfound Glory play, and I have pictures that I took, so I know I saw them play. But
I don't think there were a lot of musical shows at the Sportsplex. How did you even land on that as a venue for that show?
I don't know of any, actually. I live in Coral Springs now, but I didn't at the time. But we did have a street team. And that's the other thing I didn't mention that happened around the same time of all ages shows. In order to promote the best way we could, I could go to the arena and pass out flyers, but we needed a street team that would get out into the neighborhoods and out into the schools where the kids were. So we had a lot of young people on our street team that were very passionate about music and they probably went on to big and better careers, and maybe some became lawyers and doctors, who knows, but they were Slammie street team members, and they would help us at shows. And a couple key members of our team, I wish I remembered their names right now. I should have written them down, but they were great. And they were Coral Springs teens that were involved in the city events and helping the city book teen events. And they kind of ushered us in the door. We got in the door with Newfound Glory, and Newfound Glory, of course, is from this area. So we were able to pull that off. It was a very expensive show to do. It wasn't much of a profit, I don't recall, but it was a big show for Newfound Glory, a big show for the scene. And I don't know if they've done other events there. Maybe they have, but that was a unique situation. It was a fun one to do. It was always fun to work with Newfound Glory. Those guys were so earnest and great. And this is another example of bands working hard. What they used to do when they first started, when they were called a Newfound Glory, I remember, nobody really knew who they were. And I knew Chad, from his other bands. He was in Shai Halud, and Chad would always come to me and say, Jim, can we play? Let's put me on this show, put me on that show. And eventually I would relent, put them on the MXPX show, and they did great. Anytime you gave them the opportunity to open, and Nonpoint was the same way. And they're both still playing today, which says a lot. They were so eager to play when they were just starting out. They would play for anybody for nothing. So, it pays off to have that kind of attitude. I remember Dashboards when Chris first started out, and I knew Chris from the Vacant Andes, and he was in Further, and Chris was like the nicest guy in the world. And he started Dashboard Confessional, and they played Ray's Downtown in West Palm Beach, which was doing some all ages shows, very small venue, like a couple hundred people at the most. And Grant did that show without me, and because I didn't really pay much attention to it. And he's like, dude, you got to come see this. You won't believe it. The whole crowd is sitting there on the floor singing every lyric to every song, and he doesn't even have an album out. And next thing you know, Dashboard Confessional signed. They're playing 1,000 people at Ovation. Then we booked them at Millennium, and then Ovation, and then next thing you know, he's on the Late Show or the Tonight Show. So it was
Exactly.
fat. Yeah.
Did you have any relationship with Ray Carbone up in Palm Beach?
Yeah, over the years I knew Ray. Ray was a cool guy, and I did a lot more shows at Respectable Street because of the venue is better and bigger and more appropriate for the kinds of bands I was doing. But we did some shows with Ray at his club too, and there's always a lot of guys in the scene you can rely on. And Ray, he's one of those. Rodney Mayo, who owns Respectables and an entire empire of restaurants and clubs. I mean, he's crucial and doesn't get enough respect of keeping the scene alive. I think he's another guy that finding decent, honest people in the nightclub and restaurant business in those days was even harder, than the music business. So that was the challenge for us, connecting the dots and making sure we could honestly do a good job in this kind of an environment. It got scary at times and tricky, and I wouldn't say I feared for my life, but there were some dangerous scenarios that we got ourselves into, and then we got ourselves out of it. you have to kind of just go with the flow in those kinds of situations. We had a deicide show at the prop room. I think it was called the prop room. It was called Crocco's. It's catty corner from the culture room. So it's not there anymore. They bulldozed it. It's long gone. And
It was upstairs at the theater nightclub.
Yeah, upstairs at the theater. And the theater had some big shows too. Can't remember exactly who we promoted there, but when Deicide played, they got bomb threats. The club actually got bomb threats, and they kind of just they said, "Don't worry about it, no big deal." So I didn't worry about it, but I didn't get too close to the stage either. But we searched everybody. We made sure we tried to make for a safe environment for people. I mean, it wasn't. I wouldn't say it was dangerous. It was just, dealing with people in the music business is more of a hassle than the show itself. For me, dealing with the kids and the people at the shows was a lot of fun.
I think the band that you may have booked the most as far as Florida was Against All Authority. Does that sound right to you?
There might be one or two unsigned bands that we book more often, but AAA definitely is near the top. I kind of like at least a dozen or more events. And AAA was great on multiple levels just because of, their integrity and their music was just fantastic. And you could plug them in as an opening band for a national act, and they would bring that national act to a higher level. That show became a big event when AAA was opening. And then they could headline their own shows too. So we did quite a few shows with AAA. I remember just some different kinds of events with them. They played with Blowfly in Miami. Another promoter friend of mine, Tom Bowker, was managing Blowfly, and he says, "Hey, why don't we do this Miami show with Blowfly and AAA?" And I said, "Well, sure, why not?"
On that flyer was also Torch.
Yeah.
So was that one of your first times having them on a bill that you were promoting?
That might have been the one and only time. I know Torch kind of came at the metal scene kind of late in the game, so they missed out on the whole Slammie. But I knew Juan from his days in other bands, so I knew Juan from Torch. So yeah, that was an eclectic show, that's for sure. But for the most part, AAA was like obviously they're like the punk band you most associate with the South Florida scene from that whole time period. And today they just played a reunion. I don't know if it was a reunion show or just a show that they've been playing quite a few times. I know you had Danny on recently. They just played Revolution downtown Fort Lauderdale. So glad to see them still playing shows.
Absolutely. Another band you also promoted a show for quite, I would say, a handful plus times was Sick of It All from New York City.
Right.
What was that like for their type of crowd that comes out? I know, having seen them play twice, those shows can be quite intense as well.
Yeah, I booked Sick of It All quite a few times, more so in the later years, and I don't know if it's because their crowd had mellowed out over the years, and we were getting an older. As it got into like 2010s and into those years, I got more into booking older bands. As the younger bands were graduating up to arenas and playing bigger shows, I had to fill my club dates. So I would love booking older bands like the Dead Kennedys at Respectable Street, and I booked a Jello spoken word, and then I booked the Adolescents, and then I booked Youth Brigade, and quite a few of the older bands. And not that Sick of It All fits into that, but they've been around a while. So booking them in the later years was not a big deal, and Agnostic Front too. But back in the 90s, they were kind of scary just because of the crowd they drew. It wasn't them; it was the crowd in South Florida in that time period, which changed over the years. But at some point, I think I don't know if it was Sick of It All's idea, but I was talking to one of the guys in the band, and they were great. They were their own security, by the way. They did not need security. They basically told me, no, don't worry about it. And I saw why when they played the Factory. The first kid that tried to jump on stage, the guy from Sick of It All like, knocked him like 10 feet back into the crowd, and nobody tried that again. So they said, well, why don't we just stand outside the venue with you? And if any bad dudes, come up and try to get in, we'll tell them, go fuck off. So, so for a couple of shows, Sick of It All helped us. I mean, they basically stood outside and said, if you're going to fuck around at this show, you can't come in. So they were great to work with. It's like one of those bands that seem scary, but they're not. But I helped Churchill's do their 30th anniversary show with a bunch of bands in 2009. That was fun. It was the 30th anniversary, so we had like every local band we could come up with play that event. That was cool. Radio Baghdad played, Charlie Pickett played, the Holy Terrors. It was a fun event.
Yeah. I know you're wearing your Radio Baghdad shirt, so that's a cool artifact there, Jim. So any memories of seeing Radio Baghdad?
Actually, very recent memory. I saw them about a year ago when they had a reunion show in Fort Lauderdale. It's all but one guy. Pete Gross couldn't make it, unfortunately, but they were fantastic. Seeing Radio Baghdad again after all those years. And Chris is still a fantastic drummer. And Irish Car Bomb also played. And that's another band that we booked. I probably booked Irish Car Bomb more than Radio Baghdad because it was hard to get those all five guys together sometimes for some reason. But Irish Car Bomb was another great local band. So many.
There are so many, especially when you think about the length of time, that window that we're looking at where all this was happening. So as you were nearing the end of Slammie Productions, how are you feeling about that? Because this has been something that was, again, not your full-time job, but you are allocating so much time and so much energy and all of this passion that you have into Slammie Productions. So as it's nearing its end of life, what's going on in your head at that time?
I guess it was kind of like a slow fade. It wasn't really abrupt. There was a lot of things that changed over the years, and we've seen it in the whole music and concert business. Things change. So there's fewer and fewer, clubs that do local bands, and they're still around. They're still cool. I try to get out as much as I can. I don't get out as much anymore, but just the whole scene kind of changed. I lost partners. Grant retired, and then I had another partner who was great for a while, and then he moved, and then I had another partner, and then I had another partner, and it just gets tiring after a while. At the very end, I was just working directly with clubs like Churchill's and Respectables, and I was also getting on in years. So to be a 50-something-year-old doing all ages punk shows is fun. But I didn't have the energy for it anymore. So that kind of faded out, but it was still fun. I would, like I said, those older artists working with, and, legends like Dick Dale, I got to meet and work with Dick multiple times. I mean, talk about DIY. Dick did everything on his own. He didn't even have a booking agent. I still have his phone number, rest in peace, in my phone. I could just call Dick Dale and say, when are you touring? Okay, we'll book you here. We'll book you there. He was fantastic to work with, and the touring business kind of really changed. And at the end, I was booking some of those bands, and they didn't really come with a crew anymore, like Agnostic Front or the Business, or they would just tour with the band members and maybe one guy helping them out. And I would settle because they were getting squeezed by the record. They weren't making money. They had to figure out how to make money, and doing these tours was doing it. So I was kind of felt like I had to keep going to help those guys out, at the end there. But at a certain point, 2017, the shows were kind of drying up, and I said, maybe I shouldn't do this anymore. It's been fun. 25 years is enough.
Did you feel like there was almost this passing of the torch to others that were up and coming that started to promote shows after you had bowed out?
Oh, sure. I mean, I probably passed the torch, hopefully 15, 20 years ago. I really wanted other people to be doing what I was doing. I was doing it, not necessarily, for my own benefit. I wanted other people to do this. I encourage other promoters, and, clubs are now doing a lot of what independent promoters used to do. They do in-house now, which is smart. And a lot of cities always did that. South Florida just didn't have the infrastructure. I mean, clubs like the Button and Revolution and the Edge, the bigger clubs could do their own in-house booking, but independent promoters really played a key role in the scene back in those days, and they still do. I mean, there's still a need for independent promoters, but people didn't realize everything we did. We kind of tied up everything into one package. You know, we worked with the local bands, we worked with the record stores, we worked with the radio stations. We did a lot of things that were necessary, but the internet's kind of taken over promotion from, you don't have all of that anymore. So
once the Slammie Productions was all said and done, where did you go from there?
Well, I'd already kind of phased into a new portion of my life, got married, moved to a new city. I was still working at the Palm Beach Post, but I kind of found myself in the midst of what they call the tiki scene, the Polynesian pop scene. As you can see here, I'm a little bit of a fanatic about it. So there's a lot of old punkers and a lot of old rockers in the tiki scene, to no surprise. So I felt very much at home. And since around, I don't know, early 2000s, I've sort of been heavily involved in the tiki community, and that's pretty much where I spend most of my spare time nowadays. And it's fun and less headaches of doing concerts. I mean, you don't
How did you even get into the whole tiki scene in the first place?
Well, it was sort of kind of through my promotion. It was kind of still when I was still promoting shows. There were some cool bands playing. I tried to get Dick Dale onto one of the events, and that didn't work out. But Low Straitjackets were available, and I helped book them at an event called the Hookie Lao. And the Hookie Lao has been around for 20 years now, more than 20 years. So that's the local event where people come from all over the country and enjoy tiki cocktails and culture and music and art. It's all taking place in Fort Lauderdale at the Mai Kai restaurant, which has been around for 68 years. So it's a historic restaurant. And what's happening is, it's like a cool scene. It's like there's a lot of artists involved. There's a lot of musicians involved. And my friends are still musicians. My friends are still artists. They're just more in the tiki realm than in the punk rock realm. But there's a lot of crossover. I see guys all the time. It's like, don't I know you from somewhere? Oh, the tattoos. You can usually tell by the tattoos that they're guys from the punk scene.
Where does the name Atomic Grog come from?
Oh, that's another name I came up with. It's my blog. If you go to slammie.com, which is the website I've had for years, there's now two ways you can go. You can go to the Slammie site where all the old concerts are going to be archived. And I'm hoping by the time this video is out that my site will be updated. I'm giving it a very good refresh so you can see tons and tons of old photos and flyers and posters and some of that stuff you've been showing. But I'm also posting some new stuff. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the Atomic Grog is the other side of the Slammie domain, and that's my blog where I write about all kinds of things that involve tiki culture and music and art and cocktails. And a lot of my cocktails are popular, so I get a lot of traffic and people that I've met and become friends with. And so now I'm going around the country doing tiki events. So I'm in Atlanta at Inuhele event in January. I'll be in Orlando at the Tiki A Go-Go event in March, and Low Straitjackets is coming down to play that, so that'll be fun. And then I'll be back at the Hookie Lao event in June in Fort Lauderdale. So I'm still involved in events. Can't get that out of my system, but I'm also just an all-around journalist. So I still write and I still do things that involve my blog. So that keeps me busy and keeps me out of trouble. But
Sure.
As far as the Slammie site goes, though, doing this interview with you kickstarted me to update that site. So there hopefully will be a fresh new site for Slammie fans to go back and look. I want to see people reminisce about the old shows. I post flyers and photos over on my Facebook page that I still have. It's Slammie Productions on Facebook. And I'll post flyers and photos and stuff every time there's an anniversary of a concert. So like in a couple of days, it's the anniversary of one of the Youth Brigade shows. So I'm going to post that flyer. And I'm continuing to do that to sort of engage some of it's cool to see people, hey, yeah, I was at that show, or, I was in high school when I was at that show. So, that's cool to see. And while I was going through and digging stuff up for this interview, I found a couple of old tapes. So the first Slammie Awards from 92 and the second from 93, I had them digitized. So I'm in the process of getting those up on YouTube. So for the first time ever on YouTube, you'll be able to see the first two Slammie Awards shows. And I also have a bunch of tapes of radio commercials too that I just found. I was looking at them. Some Newfound Glory, the Newfound Glory Coral Springs event. I guess we did a radio spot because I don't remember it, but I have a tape. So there's that and an old Marilyn Manson radio commercial. So I'm going to digitize those and also get those up. So I'm still trying to dig up some old historical stuff and keep that site up there just for historical reference. I think it's important, like what you're doing, so people can remember and look back at what the scene was, and just to document it is cool.
And I think it's just great being able to have you on, Jim, to take that trip and share these memories and all the different experiences. And I know if we were going to go into every one, it would take us days to.
Yeah, it's a lot more scary.
There's so much to unpack. And the fact that you've been so gracious enough to take us through some of that journey and all of the wonderful times, the highs, the lows, and just being able to have this opportunity to have you on, it's been really amazing. So I thank you for sharing that with everyone here.
It's been my pleasure, and once again, kudos to you for everything you're doing and keeping the scene alive too, as well as and remembering everything. And we don't want this all this cool stuff to disappear, and keep the memories alive, but also keep supporting new music and new bands and new events and concerts and all that stuff too. That's
right. No doubt. And as we get ready to close things out, I would love to give you the last word. Any final thoughts you'd like to share to the folks out there, both listening to this episode and watching it on YouTube? The floor is yours to take us home.
I wish I had some great words of wisdom, but this is something we used to say all the time. It sort of became almost like a cliche, but support your local scene. That's what you do.